So, yesterday, I spoke a bit about. Alex, do me a favor and give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay. Yesterday, I spoke a bit about regret and remorse. And we're going to continue with that theme today. Just to recap, regret is when you feel bad about something that you did which negatively impacted you. These words are largely synonymous, and they're used in colloquial English as synonyms oftentimes. However, when you get into the mental health profession, you get into psychology, a lot of terms get more rigorously defined. Shame versus guilt, for instance. Usually guilt is thought of as when you break your own values, and shame is when you break society's mores or society's values. Sometimes lay people will say, like in popular psychology will say, guilt is when you feel like you've done something wrong. Shame is when you feel like you are something wrong. There's no rigorous definition that's universally agreed upon amongst mental health professionals. People make their case, and if people make their case well, then that may become the prevailing view. The prevailing view with regard to regret and remorse is that regret is when you lament something you did because it negatively impacted you. And remorse is when you feel regret, but it extends beyond yourself. You regret your actions, you regret something you thought or said or done, but it goes beyond yourself, and it's very much about you hurt somebody else. And therefore, remorse includes and goes beyond regret in that it's more selfless, and it has an empathetic component that is absent in regret. Therefore, somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder could feel regret, but they could not feel remorse because of their diminished capacity for empathy. We spoke about regret vis-a-vis remorse. And then we also looked at what remorse leads to, and we discussed how to make amends, how to make a proper apology, the cathartic effects remorse can have on someone, and how much it can make people grow, and how remorse properly expressed can lead to reconciliation, which goes beyond excusing and condoning and pardoning and forgetting and even forgiving, because it's a restoral of a relationship. We looked at what a powerful catalyst properly expressed remorse can be for that. Okay, that was a little mini recap. I'm going to skip over detailing apologies and such. I thought what we would do today was, because yesterday's discussion was very much about how we relate to others. Remorse is regret when you care about other people. And so it's not just about you and your concept of self, but it's you and your concept of self in relationship to the rest of the world. Does that make sense? It's you and who you want to be, and your integrity and what you aspire for, and your love for other people. Does that make sense? Regret is more insular. It's more about you. Remorse is about other people, and therefore it contains you relating to other people. One of the other people that you relate to in life is God. I don't think normally most people look at things in such a simplistic way. But God is a person, and you have a relationship with God just like you have a relationship with other people. And so in the same way that you may feel regret, which if you grow up could become remorse, you can also feel remorse with regards to your relationship with Krishna. Now, Krishna is a singularity. So, one of the elements of making amends is that you tell the person what you did wrong and what was going through your mind while you did it. You follow? Now, given that Krishna is an omnipotent being, and omnipotence, properly conceived of, also includes within it omniscience. Because your power of thought is one of your powers. So an omnipotent being would automatically be omniscient. You follow? So, given that Krishna is an omniscient being, is conceived of as a singularity, and one of the ways in which Krishna's singularity is that he's omniscient, then Krishna already knows what you were thinking when you did what you did. He also knows what you did. The sun and the moon are the eyes of the divine being. They see everything. So, because Krishna knows everything, usually at some point in our evolution we start to think, well, why should I pray at all? Why should I tell Krishna anything at all? He knows everything already. Have you ever felt like that? Generally speaking, have you ever felt like that? It was a question. No, you haven't? You haven't evolved enough to think like that. Everybody else in the room has? Okay. So, generally speaking, this happens at some point. When you're praying and you're revealing your heart to the deity, at some point, you think, well, wait a second, Krishna knows everything, therefore I don't have to. Like, why? Like, it's like I'm wasting God's time. It starts to feel a little unnecessary or redundant or childish or representative of a poor conception of divinity, and you almost get to a place where you just don't feel like there's any use in telling Krishna anything. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. The normal Christian answer you'll get, the sort of enlightened Christian answer you'll get, if you were to ask a halfway decent pastor at any church in America, he or she would respond to you and say that, no, you don't pray so that God knows. He does already know. But you pray so that you become aware of it. You become thoughtful about it. It's for you to reckon with and reconcile with and deal with and own up to what you've done. And so by putting it into words and thoughts, you own it. A lot of times we have half-baked thoughts. This is so often why people think they have something relevant to say, but then they open their mouths and they sound like driveling, idiots. Because they have a half-baked thought running through their brain at high speed. But most people don't slow their thoughts down and then think them through. A lot of times we're comfortable with just sort of half-conceived of notions in our mind. It's an exercise, it's a discipline to think through and examine your thoughts. So the normal answer you would get from an enlightened Christian in middle America or something like that would be that you pray for your benefit, not for God's. It's not that God doesn't know. God does know. You need to know. You need to think it through, and you need to own it. I like that answer. I don't want to knock a decent Christian for his good answer. I don't want to be an unnecessary hater. But I have a little bit of a different answer. Not really an answer that's mutually exclusive or that nullifies the validity of that answer. But I think in a way that augments that answer. And that is that when you talk to somebody and you tell them and you speak to them and you connect with them, and it's healing. And so I think above and beyond it being beneficial for us to pray to Krishna, I think it's beneficial for our relationship with Krishna, and I don't just think from our end. If Krishna is sentient, if you have free will, and you use that free will to turn towards Krishna and acknowledge your mistakes, that should affect God. A deity who's totally unaffected by you in any way, shape, or form is a robot. Love, by its very constitution, requires you to become vulnerable to another party and to let that person in, so to speak. For a God to be capable of love, real love, like significant love, love with a capital L, then Krishna would have to be affected by us in some capacity. Krishna speaks of being affected by us. He says things like that he feels anukampa for us, that he shakes for us. He tells Arjuna, I'm telling you this one more time because you're so dear to me. He many times in the Gita says that he loves us. He speaks of his love for us. He says, Samoham sarvabhuteshu na me dveshta asti na priyaha. I am equal to all. No one is hated by or loved by me. Literally, it means like no one is despised by or spoken ill of by, and no one is favored by me. But the way the words are used as antonyms, I think the cleanest translation into English would be love and hate. Although Krishna says, Asti na priyaha, and no one is dear to me or loved by me. Although Krishna says that, priya. Later on in the Gita, he says, Priyos asime dridhamiti, because you are so loved by me. Priyosime, you are dear to me. You are loved by me. And so there are multiple places in the Gita where Krishna contrasts the language where he established himself as being aloof. He's udasina vat. He is situated apart from. He's indifferent to. He's adhyakshena. He's overseeing the world. He's seated apart from the world. He's akarcham. He's a non-doer in the world. No one is dear to him. He uses this kind of language to establish his detachment from the world, his transcendence from the world. But in the same text, later on, as part of Krishna's wrapping things up with a bow tie, he repeatedly states, unequivocally, he states his love for us. Repeatedly. a hint for how to resolve this is that Krishna also speaks about being sukha dukkha samakritva, being the same in pain or pleasure, and being near dvandva, being beyond the dualities of happiness and distress. And he speaks disparagingly about people who become sukha spriha, elated in happy times. But then Krishna speaks about an antar sukhi, an internal happiness. Sukham atmani vindati, you find happiness within yourself. Tushta atmani eva atmana tushtaha, you find satisfaction within the self. He speaks about a sukha aikantika, an absolute happiness. And so Krishna is saying, don't become wrapped up in the happiness and distress of this world. There is a happiness beyond this world. I think we can use that same understanding and we can look at and troubleshoot. Don't become wrapped up in the love and hate of this world, but go to a transcendent place where you can feel actual love, spiritual love, eternal love, permanent love, non-sectarian love. Of course, a deity incapable of love would in some ways be not omnipotent. If you define omnipotence carefully and you define goodness as a power or a value that one should have, then omnipotence implies omnibenevolence as well as omniscience. A lot of times, goodness isn't derived from, you can't get the is-ought discrepancy. Science can tell you what is, but it can't tell you what you ought to do with it. That's a moral judgment. It's a metaphysical judgment. It's ethics. It goes beyond what the physical world can teach us. The is-ought dilemma. Ted Bundy, the serial killer, when being interviewed, they love to interview serial killers because it's such a... first of all, they want to figure out how many victims they had. But also they're trying to peer into the abyss and see into the mind of a madman so they can better profile and better track such things. Anyway, Ted Bundy threw out the is-ought dilemma on the people he was talking to. He's going, you guys aren't honest philosophers. You guys are just making arbitrary moral judgments of what I ought to do. But you can't move from is to ought. This world is what it is. How can you judge me? At least I'm brave and I can own the fact that there's no absolute morality, that you can't move from is to ought. You can't move from what is in the world to what you ought to do with the world. So you make a judgment what you should do with something, how you should treat somebody, that you should follow the golden rule. You're now making a metaphysical value judgment that you cannot get without referring to a God or something like that. That's why somebody could say, you should treat people better because they'll live for longer. I don't want people to live for longer. Well, you wouldn't want them to hurt you. Yeah, but it's the law of the jungle. I don't want them to hurt me. They don't want me to hurt them. If I can hurt them, I'm allowed to do it. What if I get pleasure from causing somebody else pain? Well, no, you shouldn't get pleasure from somebody else's pain. Who are you to tell me that? Why not? Well, because it's wrong. Why is it wrong? That's the is-ought dilemma. There are ways to overcome it. It's a whole topic, but you can Google it. It's a real thing. People think about and write about and have for a long time. Hume wrote about this. The Scottish philosopher Hume wrote about this extensively. Okay, so I lost myself.
You're talking about you went from the way a Christian theologian would talk or explain why we should pray.
Yeah, but how did I get to is-ought? How did I get to metaphysics and moral theory? More? Give me something else. Anything else?
You were going to give us your answer and then...
My answer is that Krishna becomes vulnerable in dealing with us an automaton, postulating himself to be aloof from this world. Okay, it took a minute. It was a bit of a tangent. All powerful is what is. You follow? All good is what ought to be. You could carefully define all powerful such that goodness became a power that an omnipotent being would have, and therefore an omnipotent being, in addition to being omniscient, which is easier to define, knowledge as a power, would also be all good. However, somebody could argue, no, you can't move from is to ought. All powerful is what you are, and all good is what you should be. And therefore you have to say God is all good and all powerful. And that's a way of covering both bases of what's objectively is and what ought to be. Did you guys follow that? That's what I was saying. It was like a long-winded way of making this point. So an all good God, however you get to all goodness, would be capable of loving. Loving means vulnerable. Loving means, to some extent, relative. You're affected by other people. Krishna says he shakes for us. He quivers for us. That indicates that we affect God. Therefore, in addition to it being beneficial for us to reveal our mind to the deity and establish a connection, it would also be beneficial for God. It would also be a relationship builder for him as well. If it wasn't a relationship builder for him as well, it would mean he's totally unaffected by what we do, and that would mean that the love between God and the devotee is very remote, if existent at all. Did you follow that? It's hard to conceive of a love which is not affected at all by anything anybody does. If that love did exist, it would be much more remote, much less vital. Mostly we like to think of the deity as being aloof from everything, unaffected by everything. But I think it's actually a callous conception of God. I think God is the best of everything, and love is a good thing, and love means allowing people in and becoming vulnerable and being affected by people. Love is risky. Krishna says, I'll give you liberation easily, but love is much more difficult. Krishna says that I'm controlled by my devotee. This is like something our literature goes into in great detail. Just how powerful prema is. Prema is Krishna Akarshini. It attracts the all-attractive one. Radharani is Madan Mohan Mohini. She bewilders that person who bewilders the world. She intrigues that person who intrigues the world. Madan means Cupid. Madan Mohan means the person who intrigues Cupid. Madan Mohan Mohini is the female person that intrigues the male person that intrigues Cupid. That's a name for Radharani. Prem, love for God, is called Krishna Akarshini. It attracts the all-attractive one. Krishna can shake for us. Now, if Krishna isn't affected by us, you end up with this, generally speaking, you end up with what we call a monergistic world. Monergism is the Protestant doctrine that whatever you do in this world doesn't really affect anything. And there's this thing called irresistible grace, which is where God wants to. He brings you back to him. He enlightens you. He overcomes all of your resistance. It's irresistible grace. And so monergism was a favorite of John Calvin and his followers, kind of early Protestant theologians. The problem with monergism is that evil is God's fault, and whatever we do wrong also becomes God's fault. And it's really tough to live in a world where we have significant free will, but yet irresistible grace exists. And so irresistible grace, monergism, really does away with free will and puts God on the hook for why some people go to heaven and some people go to hell, which is a rough one. It's like a bad bet for the deity. It's not like, it's tough to survive that deficiency and have any kind of a reasonable conception of an all-good and all-powerful God at the end of the day. Synergism, where we do our part and Krishna does his part, where we cooperate together, where we have significant free will, where we are a factor in the construction of reality, where we're adding. to reality, where the future doesn't exist in the same way the past does. The future exists as possibility, not as fact. The past exists as fact. The future exists as possibility, but our free will is a determining factor, and therefore the jury's out on whether we're going to turn towards Krishna. And if we do turn towards Krishna, would an all-good God be affected by us turning towards him? Would an all-good God cry to see us suffer? Would he smile to see us happy? Is it a deficiency to have feeling, to have emotion? Maybe if you've adopted like Hellenic modes of thinking of like the ancient Greeks that presuppose that the less human you are and the less feeling you have, the more real you are. But there's no reason to make that assumption. That's just assuming impersonalism. You'd have to argue for that. I would argue that a full conception of divinity would entail the ability to love, which means the ability to be affected by, which means synergism, which means we have free will, which means the way we choose to roll is significant. Here's a couple of verses. Ye tu sarvani karmani mayi sanyasya matpara ananyenaiva yogena mam dhyayanta upasate tesham aham samudharta mrityu samsara sagat bhavami nachirat parta maya veshita chetasam. Ye tu sarvani karmani. But those who all their actions, sarva karma, sanyasya matpara, they surrender it to me and hold me as the highest object. Ananyenaiva yogena, and with undeviating yoga, dhyayanta, they meditate on me. Dhyayanta mam upase, they worship me by meditating on me. For those people who behaviorally give all their actions to me, that's sarva karma sannyas. They give all their actions mai, to me. And then cognitively they think of me. Ananyeva yogena mam dhyayanta upase. They worship me with their minds by thinking of me, by meditating on me. Dhyan. They meditate on me. Tesham, for those people. Tesham aham samudharta. I am their savior. See the synergism? You give yourself to me, and then I pick you up. Samudharta means I uplift you. Mrityu samsara sagarat, from the ocean of death. I pick you up. Like imagine if you're drowning in an ocean, and someone reaches down from above and just picks you up. Bhavami nachira parta. I become this for you, quickly. Maya veshita chetasam, for those whose minds are absorbed in me. So there's a cognitive and a behavioral component for what we need to do. Meditating on Krishna and then giving all our life to Krishna. But then Krishna also has a responsibility in the relationship, and there's a synergism. And there's works and grace. There's what God does and what we do. What he does we can't do. He plucks us up from the ocean of death. But we're also doing something to make that happen. And when he says, I quickly do this, he's like, it's almost reassuring. I'll be there. I'll take care of it. I'll be there. I think synergism is a superior idea to monergism. I think the implications of synergism are that God is affected by us. And our free will is a constituent factor. And God's not just a vending machine where when we use our free will right, he like presses the liberation button. That's not the picture that's painted in the Gita. This resolves the conundrum of how Krishna can, at one level, not love us, and on the other level, love us so much and be so affected by us. This resolves that conundrum from the Gita. And it leads us to the idea that when we share with the deity, and when we feel remorse, great remorse for the mistakes we've made, some of which are existential mistakes, some of which are like fundamental, like almost operating system mistakes. They're not software errors, they're operating system errors. They're basic errors. My guru used to say, you think like Adam and Eve left Krishna a long time ago, but if you look in your heart, you'll see that you're leaving Krishna at this very moment. You're turning away from Krishna at this very moment. We're bahir mukha. Our faces are turning away instead of unmukha, turning towards Krishna. Mukh means face. Bahirmukh, it's turning away, turning outwards. Unmukh means it's turning unto Krishna. When we make mistakes with people, generally speaking, we've made a certain mistake at a certain period in time. We need to apologize for it and reconcile it. Sometimes you realize you made that mistake because of some deep-seated issue you have in your heart. The problem with remorse is if you really express remorse, you have to actually deal with that issue. And you have to grow. Therefore, you can say to the person, I've changed. I won't do this in the future. You can trust me. Look at the changes I've made in my life. Here's what I've done. A real remorse becomes cathartic, because usually when you did something wrong to one person, you've done something wrong to other people in similar circumstances. And to reconcile, it means you have to actually reconcile yourself. When you get into your relationship with Krishna, you're going even beyond this lifetime. You're going to every lifetime. It becomes an existential operating system level rebellion. And so opening the door, the Pandora's box of feeling remorse towards the deity, is the most cathartic. Properly done, it results in you making amends with everybody. It also opens you up to a reconciliation. And that reconciliation with the deity is grace. We become receptive, we become open to change, we become desirous of change. We reach out, we ask for help. And then Krishna is able to miraculously and substantively and powerfully step into our lives and change the very fabric of reality. Move mountains for us. Change the laws of the universe in order to give us another chance. He's able to disintegrate our karma, pull us closer than we could ever do if we were trying to build a stairway to heaven, and infuse us, inject us with wisdom far beyond what we ever might develop through the use of our mental faculties on our own. Grace is really a reconciliation between you and the deity. And the price you pay for that is remorse. That's why it's synergistic and not monergistic. That's the responsibility that attends to us because we have free will. You can see here, Krishna surveys karma, jnana, and bhakti. Karma is a path for people who are lusty and want to enjoy this world, so they have to regulate their activities. Jnana is a path for people who are over this world and want to reject the world, so they cultivate renunciation. Bhakti is jata shadho matkatashu. Faith born. There's faith born in you. Matkatashu, for talking about me. That includes kirtan and everything else. Faith has awakened within you to do kirtan. Nirvina sarvakarmasu. You've become disgusted. You've become disgusted by sarvakarmasu, by all the stuff going on in this world. You're over it. But Veda dukatmakam kamam. Although you know that all kam or lust leads to duk or suffering, parityage api anishwaraha. you're unable to renounce it. You have awakened faith in me. You've awakened faith in the process of kirtan. You know that the material world is not going to make you happy. You know that the material world is only going to lead to suffering. But you can't give it up. Tato bhajeta mam prita. Therefore, you should worship me happily, joyously. You should joyfully worship me. Shraddhalu dridha nishchaya, with firm faith and conviction. You should happily worship me. Jushamanas chatankaman, even though you're engaged in material activities. You know the material activities are bad for you. You know they're only going to lead to suffering. You can't give them up. And so therefore what should you do? You should keep your faith and worship me happily, even though you're still engaging in material activities. Dukodakams chagahayan. You should lament and feel remorse and feel repentant. Garhaya means, really it means remorse in Sanskrit. You should feel remorse about how, what you're doing is ultimately duk udarkan. It's going to lead to suffering. You should see that and feel like remorseful that you're making these mistakes and going in the wrong direction. You've got faith in me. We have a relationship now, but you're not honoring our relationship. And so as you're going and doing the wrong thing, you're still doing the right thing. So you're doing both now. Previously, you were just doing the wrong thing. Then you awaken faith in me. Now you're doing the right thing of worshiping me and the wrong thing of still being a materialist. Now you're doing both things. You're like straddling that fence, and you're sad, and you're suffering, and you're like unhappy about it, and you feel remorse. But somehow you're also happy. You're worshiping me prita, like joyfully. That's the price of grace in a synergistic world where God's a person and you have a relationship and responsibilities, but you have other desires, and you've awakened faith in Krishna before you've exhausted your feelings for this material world. You end up having to straddle the fence between the material world and the spiritual world. And the price you pay for doing that is you feel remorse. And that remorse is, there's two things that happen. Number one is that remorse is cathartic. It reminds you, hey, wait a second, I'm better than this. I shouldn't be doing this. I've got to be doing something else. And on the other hand, that remorse opens a door for Krishna to really fill you up with grace. It creates a receptivity. It creates a hunger. It creates an openness. It creates a vulnerability. It's us coming clean with Krishna. One of the types of prayers that we engage in with the deity is called Dainya Bodhika, where you tell Krishna how fallen you are. Tell Krishna all your mistakes. There's a benefit there. It creates a bond between you and the deity. Not just from your side, but Krishna becomes like favorably disposed towards you. He sees how sincere you are. He sees how hard you're trying. And then Krishna makes up the difference. And Krishna's a magician. He can move mountains. So, we spoke about regret vis-a-vis remorse, how one was more focused on yourself and the other one was focused on the other person. We looked at how beneficial this can be for a reconciliation. But then instead of just thinking about the other person, we should also think of God as being another person, albeit an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent one. We played around a bit with the is-ought dilemma and why it may be important to say that God's all-powerful as well as all good, because it's tough to span that divide. And, ethicists try, but it's debate. It takes a deft touch to be able to navigate from is to ought, what is to what ought to be. from what is to what you should do with what is. And so God's all good and all powerful, and if we don't live in a monergistic world, and we live in a synergistic world, and Krishna's capable of love, that means Krishna's also capable of being affected by us. And we shouldn't look at vulnerability as being necessarily a deficiency. Vulnerability without detachment is a deficiency. Selfish vulnerability is a deficiency. But vulnerability is required for love to exist, therefore we shouldn't see it in all circumstances as being a deficit. When we open up to and talk to the deity and feel remorse and think through our half-baked thoughts, it's not just good for us, like our Christian minister friend in Indiana might say, but it's also good for Krishna, because it shows him how sincere we are. It begins that relationship. We're opening a door. And because we live in a synergistic world, as we open that door and we attract Krishna, we give him permission to become involved in our lives, help us, move things forward for us. Sometimes we don't want that. St. Augustine is famous for saying, "My dear Lord, grant me chastity, and grant me faith, grant me vigilance, but not now." He wasn't done enjoying the world. So it was almost like a post-dated prayer. Like, in the future, I'll want to be chaste. In the future, I'll want to be faithful. We have to be careful when we're talking to Krishna, to leave that door open. You know, Krishna, here's what I'm dealing with, here's what I'm struggling with. I'm open to you helping me with this. I'm open to you orchestrating this. I'm open to how you want this to play out. I'm listening carefully for your voice. I spend my life carefully refining my sense of hearing so that I can hear your voice. Carefully refining my sense of touch so I can feel your touch. So I can smell the direction you want me to go in. When we show Krishna how sincere we are, when we show Krishna how serious we are, then Krishna pours his grace into us and we can actually hold it. Instead of it just kind of pouring through us and splattering on the pavement, it can be held. Those are some thoughts today on remorse and regret in relationship to the deity as opposed to in relationship to us. It's interesting, we start making amends with our brethren, but we end up making amends with Krishna. Or we start by making amends with Krishna, and then we have to make amends with everybody else. Either way, we're looking for a categorical transformation. We're looking for an overhaul. And the process of feeling remorse and expressing it, it's like doesn't matter where you grab it, you know what I mean? It's like sugar. It doesn't matter where you taste it. You get a sugar cube, it doesn't matter where you taste it, it's going to be sweet. And so these are very powerful ways to relate to the world. And whether you start with Krishna and work your way back to your fellow man, or whether you start with your fellow men and women and you work your way up to Krishna, it's the same idea. You're beginning to open your heart up to transformation. You're beginning to feel deeply. You're beginning to become an adult and own your mistakes in relationship to other people. That opens the door to a reconciliation and forgiveness. And with Krishna, it opens the door to grace, which is forgiveness and reconciliation with an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being who also feels love and also benefits and also grows and also becomes more wonderful as a result of us turning towards him. Growth is also an attribute. A God incapable of growth would not be a perfect being. We like to think of perfection as being static, but you can certainly add infinity to infinity. There's nothing mathematically incorrect about that. And so a static deity would be a deficient deity. And so a proper conception of all-powerful would also include the ability to grow. And one of the ways in which God might grow, this is called process theology, by the way, one of the ways in which God might grow is by us turning towards him and opening our hearts. And in that way, we may be able to contribute to like a universal growth, like far above and beyond ourselves, and really be a part of something bigger than ourselves. I would argue that that's the most important thing anybody can do in the world. And that door is open to everybody, and therefore everybody has the possibility of being a superhero, a savior of the world, doing the most important work. All right, 45 minutes. We knocked all that down. So, any feedback?
I have a question.
Yeah.
During Radhastami, you had spoken how there were certain elements within our scriptures, within the tradition, that always exist but weren't necessarily discovered until, like a later period of time.
Or I might say they weren't revealed.
Oh,
sure. when you go back and when you look at our sacred texts and you look at them having understood. Let's like for instance, you read the Chaitanya Vaishnava texts, and you understand the importance of prema and love and the vulnerability of God, and you go back to the Gita and you find Krishna talking about quivering for us and shaking for us and how much he loves us, and you find Krishna agreeing to be Arjuna's charioteer and serving him, and you find Krishna at the end of the Gita saying to Arjuna, have you understood, with the implication being, if you haven't, I'll explain it all over again. And you have Krishna saying, I'm going to tell you one more time because I love you so much, and if you just open the door to me, I'll take care of everything. And and rather than building big temples or doing big ostentatious worship, you can just offer me a leaf of flower, fruit, or water, and I'll accept it. When you look back on the Gita, having understood Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's contribution to the world of theology, you realize, that was there in the Gita. How come I never noticed it? And so I would say it became more overtly revealed to the world. But the duty of the pundit, the representative of tradition, is to demonstrate for you how even the more recent elucidations were encoded in the earlier text. You just missed them. And then once you've been awakened and once you became woke, you then go back and you read it and you're like, oh man, this stuff was like encoded from the very beginning. That was my just adjustment to what you said. What was your question?
The question is everything that you spoke about tonight as far as like synergism, God being vulnerable, were these ideas revealed in the Gita, or was it part of the Vaishnava tradition even prior to that? Is it always something that Vaishnavas kind of understood about the nature of Krishna and our relationship?
Sure. I read a verse in the Bhagavatam, I read a verse in the Gita. Those verses have corollaries in the earlier Upanishads. The deity was conceived of as being personal in the earlier Upanishads. A synergistic relationship between God and man was postulated in the earliest Vedic literature, the Rig Veda. The whole idea of Urta and the cycle of life and us giving back to the deity and Krishna giving us the ability to give back and thereby creating a connection between us is really the bones of bhakti. It's a relationship between the Lord and the living entity. Rasa was the ghee. Rasa was the water and the ghee that was offered back in the ancient Vedic fire sacrifice. When our theologians 5 centuries ago chose to talk about the flavor of the relationship between the soul and God, they called it bhakti rasa. They used the language of the oldest Vedic text, the Rig Veda, that was used to describe the ghee in the fire sacrifice, that was being used to indicate the way in which we reconnected with the deity by offering sacrifice. And they chose the term bhakti rasa to refer to that liquid mellow, that sweet flavor of the relationship between the soul and God. Did you follow that?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
I mean, if you followed that, your jaw should be dropping on the floor.
Yeah,
like,
no, it's
I'm hearing that and I'm like, whoa, that was profound. So I'm a little worried. Like your cool camper, cool customer vibe indicates to me you didn't get it, because I just dropped like thousands of years of wisdom on your head like a ton of bricks. Did you get it?
yeah. I mean, it's. I'm processing it. That was more than what I was expecting you to.
Okay,
answer.
all right. Let's. Okay. Yeah, I'm talking to you. So it's like if I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna give you $1 billion, and you're like, well, thank you. Just like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with our relationship? Okay. One more? Yeah, loud.
I thought it was brilliant how you related the ideas of regret and remorse from yesterday to our fundamental mistake of turning away from Krishna and expressing remorse over that to the deity.
Pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, as I was walking over here, I was like, hey, I'll do this. And I thought it was a pretty cool idea too. That's why I did it. Yeah, we should think of Krishna as being a person. We should understand that Krishna is a person. And if we do, it opens up a lot of doors. And it takes all the work we're doing on ourselves and makes it so much more valuable. Because we can springboard off of this world into that world, or we can springboard off of that world back down to this world, and everything becomes part of one great project of renovation, of rejuvenation. And we're not doing 4 things. We're doing one thing. And you get immanence, you become a better person in this world, and transcendence, that world, simultaneously. And it becomes a rising tide that raises all ships. And these ideas, these powerful ideas about how to live a better life in this world, become powerful ideas about how to relate better to the deity. That's the benefit of thinking of God in personal terms. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's call it there. Thank you guys so very much. We're going to do a look at your time now. You guys can participate.
Yes.